Hello and welcome into our video series today. This is a three-part series covering the Reformation. So let's dive into it. First thing to keep in mind here is all about information and how it spreads. Prior to this point, prior to the 1400s, we're looking at a world where information is still mainly passed down through some sort of oral means of sharing. Anything that's written is written by hand, which means that very few books are produced, and a lot of those books are in places that are inaccessible, right? Churches, monasteries, libraries. And they're also very expensive, so it's not like the average person even has the funds to be able to purchase a book like this. We also see that because of this, right, and the fact that written work is not something that's terribly accessible to most people, that most people are illiterate, okay? That the stereotypical Middle Ages person is a farmer and cannot read, and any sort of information that they get, especially religious information, is from a priest or from the church. The big change really comes, though, in the 1400s. We see that German engravers start to create typesets, and they create them out of metal, and you could combine the letters to make words, and those words could make paragraphs from there. This is not dissimilar from what the Chinese had been doing for a long time, but this is really the first time that we start to see it on a mass-produced scale in Europe. And Johann Gutenberg is credited as the main producer of the printing press, that he is the inventor, which changes things dramatically because now you could use movable type, put it into a press, and press out an entire leaf or an entire page worth of information. That made it so that books were now much more affordable, so the costs were decreasing, as well as the fact that it then made it much easier to produce books, get those books out to people, so ideas start to spread much faster during this time. We also have to look at the church prior to this point in time. The Catholic Church during this period of history is dealing with a lot of corruption issues. One is tied into financial corruption, that we see that there's an increase in taxes and tithes for the church, mainly, again, this idea of like they needed to raise money because the popes had expensive tastes, as well as the cardinals and other clergy members. They had very large estates. They would throw lavish parties. They were big patrons of art, like we talked about in the Renaissance. And that money needs to come from somewhere, and where it really comes from is church taxes. The other thing that we see is that they're going to abuse, or they're going to be very corrupt in the way that information is regulated. Basically, to silence critics. If you were criticizing the church, you would be considered to be a heretic, that you were committing heresy, this crime of speaking out against the church. And that could result in a couple of threats. One could be threatening to take away your salvation, that they could excommunicate you from the church, they could kick you out, and by that, you would not be able to get into heaven. And then they also utilize physical abuse or torture, as well as executions, as another way of trying to silence anyone that was going to speak ill of the church. So again, they're corrupt in the way that they're holding power, passing information. Financially, they're corrupt. They're just also immoral at this point in time. They're not holding up these pious or priestly values. They're having children. They're drinking in excess. They're gambling. They're having a lot of things that we would not consider to be typically holy. When we look at education and language as well, what we see is that local priests, they're not very educated as well. A lot of these teachings are in Latin because that's what the Bible is written at this time, and very few people understand that. So what they're teaching isn't necessarily always something that's clicking properly in their minds. And again, you can see what we're talking about in terms of some of these torture methods here. The one that seems terrible to me, again, is this devil's pitchfork that was used to basically keep someone's neck in a flexed position for very long periods of time. Arguably, though, the big problem that we start to see in the church at this time, though, is related to indulgences. And an indulgence was basically this payment that you could give to the church. And essentially, it was the fast pass of its day, if you will. That everybody's going to sin, and the church, you can go to church and you can get forgiven for sins in a number of ways. But this was a way that you could pay, and the church, and by that logic, God would then forgive those sins, which would mean that since you were less of a sinner, you would have to spend less time living in purgatory, all right? This kind of like state of suffering, or like a kind of waiting room before going to heaven after death. So again, this idea was that, okay, if you paid money, it would take years off of your time in purgatory, which would then mean that you get into heaven faster. Okay, again, thinking about this as a fast pass at Disney, where you sign up to kind of skip the line in a sense. That's what we really are focused on with this idea of indulgences. And the money that comes from this is used to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, this very grandiose and beautiful church, which if you ever have the chance to visit it, I would highly recommend. But the money that's being used from this is coming from peasants from all around Europe. So we see that there's this need to reform. There's a lot of things with the church that are problematic at this time, and this call for reform really starts in Germany. Okay, and between the 1300s and the 1400s, you start to see that all these problems really start to compound. That people are not confident in the church as this leader of society anymore. The church is more worldly than it is pious, so it's not focused on religion and holy values as much as it's concerned with secular things. It's getting engaged in costly wars of conquest that are extremely expensive, and again, kind of go against this idea of like, do unto others as you would yourself, this concept, which rubs some people the wrong way. They're building these ornate churches, as well as just charging fees for like ceremonies and sacraments like baptism, marriage, funerals. Again, this is all coming down to the fact that the church is corrupt at this point in time. They're more focused on gaining power, whether that's political power, whether that's economic power over others. That's really what their goal is at this time, or that's what's perceived by most people that are parishioners of the church. So along comes this monk, and his name is Martin Luther, and he's an incredibly educated individual. He studies law, he's a theologian, and he basically teaches Bible studies or biblical studies at the University of Wittenberg, which is in Saxony, okay, a part of what will become eventually Germany. And Martin Luther is trained as he's a Catholic German monk. He is as tied into the church really as you could be in terms of like intelligent individuals. And Martin Luther's looking at all these problems with the church, and he starts to become really upset and enraged with the abuses that are going on compared to what the teachings are in the Bible. So what he does is he writes out a long list, about 95 points, or what's called the 95 Theses, which are basically these questions or these points where he calls into question what the Roman Catholic Church is doing at this point. He nails it in protest to the outside of the church door in Wittenberg Castle, basically so that the entire populace of the town can see. And this idea catches on like wildfire. Why? Well, the 95 Theses is taken, it's reprinted, it's copied down, and then reprinted using that printing press that we talked about prior to this. It spreads all across Europe, and it basically becomes this very big hot button issue of reforming the church. And while there will be reforms, we're also going to see that it's going to cause several schisms or splits with the church in Europe. Again, this idea of what's in the 95 Theses, it basically comes down to this, that the selling of indulgences is improper because you can't pay to release a soul from purgatory. You're paying by atoning or asking for forgiveness for sins. Martin Luther also says, hey, the authority of the Bible and the person's conscience, okay, their own moral values, that outweighs anything that the Pope says. So whatever they read in the Bible and whatever they feel in terms of a sense of moral righteousness, that's what's more important. Because of these things, this is directly against church teaching. So Martin Luther is charged with heresy. Right? Again, this belief or opinion that goes against the church. And what essentially happens is the Pope is extremely angry by this. He has one of his monks that is speaking out against him and originally just views him as a rebel, that he's this kind of troublemaker, this rabble-rouser. But as his ideas start to catch on and it is then seen as a bigger issue instead of just this small isolated issue related to Luther, Pope Leo issues a decree. And this decree basically says, Luther, you are going to be excommunicated. You are going to be kicked out of the church, and you will not be able to get into heaven if you do not take back these teachings. And you have this threat along with the Holy Roman Emperor. Okay? This individual, his name is Charles I. He is basically the chief monarch of Central Europe at this time. You have all these small little kingdoms, but Charles V sits as the key emperor of all of the Holy Roman Empire. And he summons Luther to Worms, okay, to stand trial. And again, is looking to get to the basis of Luther's ideology and to try to get him to take it back. He asks Luther to recant these statements, or again, to take those statements back, but again, Luther refuses. So not only is he in trouble, but he is also excommunicated from the church. He's got political issues, and Germany as a whole starts to devolve into its own conflicts. You have some German princes that are going to stay loyal to the Holy Roman Empire. If you look up at the map, the darker the orange color, the higher concentration of Catholics live in those locations. Today, you can still see the kind of divides caused by the Reformation. If you look basically principality by principality in Germany. In addition to this, we see that some other groups decide that they want to break away from the Catholic Church. And some are religious reasons, that you have people that do believe very heavily in what Luther is teaching, and that they're going to follow him moving forward when it comes to him being the religious authority, or this new Lutheran system as being the authority rather than the Catholic Church. Some others are also going to stop or break away for political reasons, that they see that there's more power to be gained by splitting from the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, because then they can control more of what goes on in their smaller kingdom. And again, this is a big problem because Germany is very fractured. You have all these small little kingdoms, and what ends up having to be solved is through the Peace of Augsburg. And this is signed basically to stop any sort of fighting that had started within different religious groups, and said that every kingdom, right, each prince could decide their own religious autonomy. So if you were the head of one kingdom, your king could decide that you were going to stay with the Catholics, while the neighboring kingdom could decide that they are going to become Lutheran. So next, we will talk about this spread, because it really is a pretty large spread and schism as we move forward. But I hope this was helpful in understanding more about kind of why the Reformation happened, the causes of it, as well as what Martin Luther did and the events that transpire after the 95 Theses. So thanks again for listening, and hope you tune in for part 2.